Welcome back to SHeCOMMERCE, where power women, smart advocates, and real talk collide in the world of commerce. It is Women's History Month. It's International Women's Day that we are still celebrating together. But before we get completely flooded with all the celebrations, pink logos, and inspirational quotes, let's be clear. This is not a complete victory lap. While we want to celebrate progress, there's still work to be done.
This is an audit. No PR, no fluff, straight talking.
Which also feels very much on brand, I have to say, for the FMCG guys as well. Like really going beyond on the things that just, look good on LinkedIn.
By the way, you may have noticed a third woman joining us here today. This is Christine. Isn't just here as a guest. She is part of our friends at the FMCG guys, which means she spends a lot of time calling out industry nonsense from a different angle. And we love the FMCG guys with Daniel and Efron. So welcome, Christine. We're so happy to have you.
I'm so happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. It was a joy meeting you a couple of years ago. Cristina, you won't be surprised that Christine and I bonded over a glass of Prosecco.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, you look shocked, Cristina.
Yeah, not surprised. Not surprised.
I think
it was in one of our shop talk events, right?
Yeah.
We were doing in Barcelona with the FMCG guys at that point. Yeah. One of the very first ones.
Correct. And, the SHeCOMMERCE and FMCG guys, I guess you could look at it as the FMCG guys is where, we break down the industry, or where you break down the industry. SHeCOMMERCE is where you break down the system inside the industry. Think of it as adjacent podcasts, shared values, slightly different challengers to the throne, shall we say. Let's get the show on the road.
Exactly. This is also why it feels very natural to be having this conversation with you guys.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm really excited, to be honest, to see where we land today, because you have three women, all with opinions. Am I right, ladies?
Yeah. And strong ones.
Very strong ones. So I'm really excited about this. So let's start with something that we've been looking at from a McKinsey report lens. Cristina, I'm going to hand this over to you to kick us off.
Let's jump in. So we did look at the McKinsey Women in the Workplace report from 2025 that was published and is published annually to pull out some stats, to get the receipts, as we say, see where we're at. And, the first one is slightly uncomfortable. It's probably one of the hardest stats that I saw in the report. So I'm just going to put it out there. For every 100 men promoted to manager, only 93% of women make that step. And when you break it down by race, the drop gets real ugly fast. So before we, do our Women's History Month bingo, I think the real question we need to answer, and ladies, this is where I'd love to hear from you. Are we over focusing on parity at the top, right? Like when we talk about diversity and companies broadcasting in and, women on boards and changing that stat, which are very important as well. But are we ignoring that, the lower levels and, the very first promotion that shapes everything after it?
I can go there, like starting with the strong opinions that we just said. I mean, like we are very much focused on kind of like the glass ceiling, which does exist, right? It's not that we should be neglecting it, but where the real problem kind of is, I would say, is this broken first step of the ladder, if it's a ladder, right? Because after this first step, everything is math, right? The pipeline is already broken. If you cannot get past that level where you get your first kind of like P&L exposure, or you get your first team to manage, and you get your first exposure as kind of like leadership material and get into those succession pipelines. So it's all nice, I will say, in lack of a better word, for companies to also have like the focus on how do they have the right mix in their leadership teams and make sure that people that are making the decisions, they get the diversity there. Yes, this is also important. But how do you build a system that ultimately enables that? By really having the right processes in place and fighting the intrinsic biases that allow women to take that first step.
That is a fantastic POV, Christine. But I'm actually going to go completely opposite to that, Cristina.
Mm-hmm.
because I think that we do have we have made progress in entry and sort of junior management. But to Christine's point, you are 100% right. It's a glass ceiling. It's not so much glass as it's in glass encased in perspex with glass bricks. And, that is some kind of bomb-proof ceiling, right? What I think, or from my perspective, I would say that change needs to happen from the top and get cascaded down. If you have more diversity at the top, if you have more women on boards, to quote Kirsten and Jacqui, then that intrinsically changes the very fabric, the very culture of an organization. So that thinking, that vibe, for want of a better word, trickles down, and people are already then starting to think of, okay, we don't just want a cookie cutter. Let's try a different perspective. Let's try a different point of view. And I believe that it's when it's from the top down that that is when you are going to be able to make change. Because you can have, Christine, we've seen it, so many incredible, fabulous people coming up through the ranks, right? Women of color, et cetera, et cetera. But they reach a point and then that's it. They are stymied and ultimately they're stymied because if you have the old guard at the top, they don't want to change. They don't want to make changes that will put their old guard and that legacy privilege at risk. But if you have that change already, then they are so much more open to, I was the change, let me bring more change. That's what I think anyway.
Where the problem is, Jacqui, that you are right. This is definitely the problem, and you cannot go on without making sure that you're solving for this part. And it's not a but, it's an and. You also need to make sure that you're creating a system that will enable women to progress, because otherwise you keep on having the panels and the mentorships and the training. You're training athletes that you never want to put out there to compete.
I love that.
You need to give them this opportunity for the first senior accountability role. You will not go from being a great marketeer to running a company because simply they want to also fix the top. There needs to be a system in the middle.
I agree. And I was going to say the same thing. I think it's what both of you said. It needs to come from the top, but there has to be the system supporting it. And it is about the pipeline too, right? We love to post about, who's the next female VP, CMO, et cetera. But we don't talk as much about all those that may have got passed over for that manager role 3 levels earlier. And I think that's the headline that everybody wants in leadership. Nobody wants to have the operating conversation about that talent pipeline. And, the pipeline doesn't leak. It gets managed. It's filtered out. It's obviously interrupted. And I think that's where we need to ensure that at every level in that, what is that ecosystem and what is that process that we continue to ensure that female leadership is represented at every level, and that we have a slate of candidates, female candidates and male, that can fill that next role. And that, like you said, we're training those athletes to be ready, but how are we serving them up for the field, right? Are they ready to jump in the game or not?
And can I share a story that made me really, really mad? I'm doing this in the boardroom. I think that the program for board readiness. And as part of one of the events, they had brought in a very senior executive from a headhunter, a super senior person who does headhunt a man for a lot of big companies for their boards. And he was explaining to us how, of course, companies are very open to having women on boards and in super high up positions. But the fact is there is no pool because you don't have enough women with experience. And I'm
that's a myth. To quote our friends at Women on Boards, it is not a supply problem. It is a demand problem.
It is a demand problem, and it is a matter of visibility and giving women who have the skills, because we have the right pipeline. We have women that we have been training for a long time, and they have the experience, and they do not get on that path to be able to be seen and acknowledged and then progress.
Yeah. Good point.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Should
shall we go to the next one?
Yes. Go for it.
Okay, it's going to be loaded, this episode, with the points that we have. So
Spicy,
from
we
the
like it.
report, at the current pace that we have in parity in senior leadership would take 22 years for white women and 48 years for all women, including women of color. And women still hold only like 29% of C-suite roles, like going back to the top problem, right? So on one hand, we celebrate progress, I guess, around, more women in leadership, but how can we still be stuck at the 29% in the C-suite?
It's actually like disheartening to hear those stats, right? And that's a long time. I mean, this is 2026 for it to be almost a half a century later for all women to get, that feels like more than necessary, right? It shouldn't be that, it shouldn't take that long. And we should honestly, in my opinion, already be there. So I think that that's the part that people, don't want to sit with. Like that representation is easier to celebrate than, the authority to really make the change at pace. And women, while they're inviting women to the meeting, it feels like men are still running the meeting, right? Based on these numbers.
My
100%.
10-year-old daughter will be 58, according to this. 58 years old, my 10-year-old daughter,
So at the end of her career,
for parity for women. And it's, as I said earlier, why is this happening and what's the reasoning? It's because the closer you get to money, control, and credibility being redistributed, the slower things move. And the reason things move slower is because it's the loss of control of authority, ownership, and that legacy privilege. It's the legacy, that power, redistributing power threatens those legacy structures. And the higher you go, the more change feels like loss to those who are already there and who haven't had to work anywhere near as hard as women of color, people of color.
Absolutely. And we're talking about like having a seat at the table. The question is like, who built that table?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
who
then,
invites
like,
you?
exactly, right?
Where do you get these
And this is why
invites?
it's uncomfortable to have these discussions and to really, like, the same way on what we're doing here, right? Instead of having a panel that say, oh, here are 10 power moves and how you're supposed to be doing public speaking to be empowered, but actually calling it out for what it is. Like, it's a system that is not built to to promote progress and actually support women to succeed, right? At the same time, it's what we're discussing also before a little bit about the type of roles that women will be able to get to be on a path to become a CEO. How are you going to be a CEO if you are never running a P&L?
That's true.
If you have a lot of women in leadership roles and they're functional leaders, right? Yeah, I'm not saying that HR is not important, but it's probably not the path to CEO. And if you're only directing women towards enabling functions, then you will never have them at the forefront.
Yeah, and I think the point you and Jacqui have made, it's like anywhere power gets concentrated. So what are those tables then where that's happening? You said P&L ownership. I completely agree. I think it's, enterprise decisions. It's where there's that operating control, GM, transformation, et cetera. So I think, again, it feels like we're being seen, but not always being heard. Those are not the same things. Neither one will automatically be equal to being able to decide. So it probably, goes back to what we're saying, like coming from the top, it has to be where the power is more concentrated and they have the authority to make those decisions. Visibility without that power is just branding, right? And something more performative, and representation without authority is just optics. So it does come back to that.
Absolutely. But it's also much easier to discuss about visibility because then you can put it on the women that they're not being visible enough. They're not loud enough. Of course, then when you do, you're like unlikable,
you're
which is
aggressive.
also a problem. Yes, exactly.
Aggressive.
Yeah,
so
it's
aggressive.
it is,
I hate that.
Yeah, it is so absolutely. You guys have just hit the nail on the head. And If you ask this question generally, industry would say, but representation has improved. Exactly to your point. For marketing, for HR, for comms, for
Yeah.
people roles, for brand leadership. But every one of those roles has limited power to make a difference. To
But
make
on the representation, let me share one of my favorite stats, which I think I've also shared in a couple of FMCG guys episodes, which is a few years ago, the number of women CEOs outnumber the number of men CEOs named John. So
Yes.
that's a win. We can
We
take
had we
that.
had we had that on the Women on Boards episode. Yeah, it is shocking,
Yeah.
right? It's like, shall
It's
we
great.
shall we move on? And I
Yes.
think the next segment is really important because if women are not moving forward at that same rate, then someone has to ask what actually does move careers forward in the first place. You know,
And
so
again,
Jackie.
we go back to, thank you, Christina. We go back to McKinsey, and they have stated that employees with sponsors are promoted at nearly twice the rate of those without them, 65% versus 35%. But at entry level, only 31% of women have sponsors, compared with 45% of men. And here's the rub. This is a conversation that we had with Aisha Khan a few weeks ago, Christina, if you remember. And almost verbatim, I think she read the same document, almost verbatim. And she was talking about
Yeah.
her career. And she specifically called out that having a sponsor was as provided a much higher yield or result than just a mentor. So the question here really is, how much of a career acceleration is performance and how much is it about who is speaking your name in the right room?
Yeah, I mean, I believe it's definitely the latter there, and probably more so than people want to admit, right? Because it is sometimes you see it. Like we all know of people where like, how did they get in that role, right? But it's like everyone kind of there knows them and is talking about them, and they stay top of mind. And sometimes that does outweigh the work you do, right? Like if you do great work, maybe people want to keep you doing that. You're just seen as a worker bee, but how do you make sure that leadership story and your brand is really known more and your ambitions as well, and it's not just you sharing that, right? Like it's the ratings and reviews, right? If you have more people saying the same thing, you're more likely to buy into something. So I think this is similar in business, right? If I tell you I'm great, okay, fine, maybe you'll believe it. But if 10 other people in the room are like, oh, this person's really great, you got to talk to her, like, let's get her opinion, let's pull her into the meeting. Obviously, that's going to be much more meaningful.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. To be very frank, like careers don't accelerate in performance reviews. They accelerate
Yeah.
in the rooms that you're not in. But let me share with you guys a framework. We were actually being taught back in my days at P&G. I'm actively bringing this up with everyone in my team, which is PI. I don't know if you're familiar with it. PI as in performance, image, and exposure. So the framework says that career success comes 10% from performance, 30% from image, and 60% from exposure. So you cannot go anywhere without the performance. Okay, there are people who manage to do that. Okay, let's meet. But the basis is, okay, you need to be fundamentally like have the foundations there of being able to do your job, right? But then you need to make sure that you're aware of how people are perceiving you and your work, and then how many people actually have seen it, how many people speak about it. Do you have anyone talking about you when you're not in the room? Do you get that exposure? And that's 60%. That's the biggest part.
Yeah. And I think this is where women disproportionately under index versus men, because women have a very hard time advocate, telling that story, and they don't want to come across, like bragging or overly confident and, advocating for themselves. I have spoken and mentored so many women that immediately downplay themselves, right? And it goes back to like women when they apply for jobs, they're like, oh, I don't have that one skill out of the 10 they're looking for, so I'm not going to apply. Meanwhile, men tend to maybe overstate some of their experience. So I think it's the same thing. Like, how do you build a platform so that people know the great work you're doing? And it's not about bragging, it's about, storytelling and sharing the work and the value add that it brings to the business, the different teams, et cetera, or people learning best practices to share. And then once you're talking about it, how do you get some of those sponsors? You're sharing that with your sponsors so they also are telling that story. And, it starts to, I'll say, become viral and become part of your image and what you're known for. And I think it's so important for women to feel comfortable and have the tools to be able to do that.
We need to start having these conversations about sponsorship more than mentorship with our girls right now. Not just right now, like from the time that they are in an environment where they have got to start advocating for themselves. And that's from nursery, right? We have got to start showing them that you don't need to tick every single box to be the person to put your hand up for X or Y. You need to build your image. You need to build your visibility. And we need to go away from everything that we grew up with, which is do really well and you'll be rewarded. If you're a hard worker, you're totally going to get promoted. You're totally going to be fine.
Yeah.
I call bullshit on that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We should have a bullshit bell that we ring when swag, it's coming. It's coming.
Yeah. Yeah, guys, you need that. But you know what? Well, I love what you're both saying. Also want to turn this around and not just say like how you as a women are struggling or trying to find sponsorship. How is everybody who's listening to this podcast actively sponsoring other women right now? Like we also need to make sure that this is part of our agenda and we do this in a purposeful way and not just when it happens, right? Unless we decide that it's about time that we change things and we take action, nothing will change. And it will not just happen with more junior women coming up to you and trying to establish a connection. You also need as a leader to make sure that you do that regardless of your gender, right? And regardless of the biases, which might be unconscious, but exist. So seek out people who are not like you and try to understand how you can sponsor them.
And can we just take a moment, because it's a really important point. Mentors advise you. They're like coaching you. This is where you'll get into the detail. I have this project. I have this conflict. I have, whatever it is. I want to work on my presentation skills, whatever. Sponsors don't necessarily do that. They don't get into all the details to coach you. They advocate for you. And as you said, when you're not in the room. So they tend to be more senior. They have decision-making authority. And I think to your point, Christine, what are sponsors seeking out people to sponsor, right? This is very much in the give to gain theme for International Women's Day this year. But that they need to have commercial credibility and they need to be willing as a sponsor to put your name against a real opportunity and say your name in those rooms for the skills you have, the ambitions you have, the roles you want, and to connect you to those opportunities. And I think that distinction is important because you might think they're a sponsor and they might think they're a mentor. And you as the person being sponsored should say to them, are you willing and able to be a sponsor for me? Meaning you, would, advocate for me in those situations. Like, I think you really need to state it clearly you want from that sponsor so that they're clear. And, hopefully you have that mutual agreement and there's going to be that value add. And I love that you said sponsors should go seek some people to sponsor as well. Think about people like in your number. You may already be a sponsor to someone like informally because you do say their name in rooms, right? You are a cheerleader, and maybe then just start there and say, have a connection with that person. Say, I'd love to sponsor you, but I'm talking about you this way. What is the narrative that you want to be shared on your behalf?
Yeah,
and
very
how do I
right.
you, even further? I think that's an easy place to start.
Yeah. I love that. I love that, Christine. Maybe that should be our call to action for this episode. If you're
Yes, go
single,
find somebody to sponsor.
go find sponsorees.
I love it.
That's
Okay, so shall we
Yeah.
transition?
Yes.
Let's go to the next
Another
one.
another stat from the McKinsey report. So only 54% of companies say women's career advancement is a high priority, and only 46% say that the same for women of color. So obviously, while many more still say we believe in an inclusive culture, diversity matters, right? I think they're all saying that. But this is where, when you look at the numbers, that say do gap becomes very evident. So, let's talk about then what no one is kind of putting in the deck. Again, who's not even getting invited to write that deck in the first place? Because that's what we really need to be talking about and how to fix it.
I think it's what Jacqui said, right? So inequity is not necessarily that complex. It's just very, very uncomfortable to talk about because then to fix it, you need to redistribute power. And we just don't want this to happen. And then you end up with like saying, oh my God, I want to empower women, right? Oh, we want to empower women. We want to give them opportunities. But then we know that women take up the majority of childcare, but mobility is number one priority. And no, we're not going to be paying you enough for your husband to leave his job, but you need to be following us wherever we tell you to go. And you just need to figure it all out on your own. So I think ultimately it's about like the cost benefit equation of what the companies are willing to offer. And because they're not willing, like people who make decisions are not willing to take the hard choices that would feel uncomfortable for the status quo, you end up with a system that will not allow it.
And that the thing is, change is hard. Let's just call it out there, right? Change is really hard, and it takes effort, and it takes thought, and it takes actually, and it takes action. And people, they don't want to commit. They want to give us cupcakes for International Women's Day, right? And part of my thinking right now, and this is, I've been having conversations on projects completely not relevant to anything we're talking here, but it's same mechanics. And that is, if we are in a situation where change is hard and people don't want to do the work, would they do the work if we gave them the template, the blueprint, the workflow, the if this, then that, the program, so that all they would need to do is execute? They would not have to create, they would not have to ideate, they would not have to build, they would not have to spend time and effort on it. They would just have to execute. Do you think that they would execute, or do you think that they would come up with another excuse because execution still means losing that privilege of control and order for yourself?
Well, I think you're trying to get to the heart of it. Like, what is the bottleneck here, right? What is the root cause? And what will it take to fix it? So if you determine what that is, and I think Christine, you probably you're onto it, right? That it it does go back to, women's flexibility around some of those work life priorities, right? Or maybe being out for childcare, having babies, like that loss of it becomes a
Maternity
cost.
penalty. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And being penalized for those things. And we know that organizations have progressed and there's paternity leave, but it's not the same, right? And so I think if we are able to find a solution to that, would there be another one? I think probably, Jackie, because comfort is still going to outrank courage in a lot of organizations, unfortunately. And it comes down to that. However, I think it would go a long way to address the root cause of why we're still seeing, these numbers and, these stats around women being behind in these regards. So yeah, I mean, we need to fix it. We need to start there.
Yeah.
More flexibility around how, advancement works in organizations. And we live in a very virtual world. Nothing stopped during COVID. So we've proven that that can work. But those international moves or relocation shouldn't be the price for advancement anymore. And I think women are definitely paying disproportionately for those.
Completely.
I'm very tempted to go with a story on that. But actually, you're giving me such a great pass, Cristina, for the next point that we have. That I think that it's worth like jumping onto it, which is on flexibility specifically. Indeed, what we read at the McKinsey report is flexibility remains common. 1 in 3 employees, so it declined in 2024. And a quarter of the companies scaled back remote or hybrid work. And women working remotely most of the time were less likely to have sponsors, connect to the previous point as well, or recent promotions. So are we telling like women, like, guys, you can be flexible, but then punish them for it, right? Because you're not there where it matters to take that leadership position.
And can I just say as well to your point, Christine, and this is I love that you bring stories to the equation. I love a good story. Men are penalized for flexibility as well, because a few roles ago, my husband was not allowed to be flexible because when he said, I have to go home because my children aren't well, they looked at him and asked, don't you have a wife? And it was
Exactly.
and he was like, oh no, you didn't never say that to my wife ever. And that was the that's not outdated. That is current. I'm not talking about 15, 20, 30 years ago. I'm talking about 3 years ago.
Yeah. And I think, that flexibility isn't a perk anymore. It is, I think, post COVID, it's the expectation that both men and women have. And I think with caregiving responsibilities and the realities of that, it needs to be part of the infrastructure. And to your point, I think men maybe there's less flexibility, like when they use that as a reason. Women, they're given that flexibility, but then penalized for it, right? So it's slightly different. But I do think this return to office policy that we're seeing as a lot of organizations do is becoming a gender equity issue. And that's scary because, again, we're now going backwards instead of forwards, which is not what we want. And it's not because like offices are evil, right? But I think that companies are confusing that physical visibility with value creation. And that couldn't be further from the truth.
And all the work, all the
boomer men running companies.
Oh,
yeah.
That's confused
Yes.
that.
Yeah. There is that. There's also, and it puts the work that advocates like Mother Pucka, who is a phenomenal advocate and changed the law in the UK for flexible working. She worked tirelessly to get flexible working into a bill here in the UK. And it's putting all of that in jeopardy or on the wayside, because at the end of the day, you can say flexible working in your contract, but that flexible working has to be truly intrinsic and not performative. And we're moving to performative yet again, which is just, it's frustrating. It's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back.
Yeah. No, it is. It is tied to how we assess performance in these organizations. And if we are defaulting, like if you think about a performance review and how this is like a pet peeve of mine, how biased they can be, right? And the few examples are you picking those favorite stakeholders that are going to only say good things. And it's at one point of the year instead of really looking holistically at your body of work and influence. I think if we default back to like those reviews, who they see most, who they know best, and who they bump into, right? The easiest, then that really creates this system that's about presence over contribution, right? And impact. And so as you think about designing like the truly modern workplace, like are those policies and what are those performance assessment, because that's very much part of it, that are going to help enable a more flexible work environment. So I think it's important to look at, the spokes coming off the wheel, if you will, of this one issue.
I think you both guys mentioned flexibility like as a perk or as a benefit. And I think this is one of the core issues to it. Like it needs to become infrastructure as long as it's as like a treat that you're giving. And then you feel that some of your employees are kind of like abusing it because like I'm just allowing them to do that. That's not how you operate. You haven't really set up this system and this environment. And we do need it. And for me, something that always comes to my mind is Indra Nuyi's book. I think it's called My Life in Full. It's an amazing book. And she, of course, she did incredible stuff as a woman in leadership, right? Being CEO of PepsiCo all those years ago. And she talks in her book a lot about the burdens of both childcare, but also care of the elderly that usually falls on
Yeah.
women's shoulders, and how many things she had to sacrifice, and how thankful she is for the support she managed to get from her ecosystem in order to have the career that she ultimately did have. So now, all those years later, where we have gone through the pandemic, we have seen how we can make things work, and we can do so successfully. Also decrease costs, increase productivity. And I'm not talking just about necessarily people need to work from home. Overall flexibility in whatever shape or form that looks
Yeah.
like. And that might include travel or working hours, all of that. It's just frustrating. But again, it's about the fear of letting go of
Control.
structures that worked in the past, structures that made certain people also feel valued in an office environment, or
Hmm.
the discomfort of some people of being at home with their families while they've spent like 35, 40 years in the workforce not doing that, and now they cannot cope. And those people are the ones that are, and
Yeah.
usually the decision sit.
And it is antiquated and it is about losing that control. But I remember one of my first roles in marketing, as someone told me more senior than me, you don't leave the office until your manager leaves. I don't care if you need to just sit at your desk and act like you're working, you stay until your manager leaves. Because again, it was like a check the box, like visibility. What does that say if you're
Yeah.
leaving for? I'm like, it says that I'm more efficient than them and I get my shit done. Like that's what it says.
Bravo.
Or
Yes,
I
exactly.
have, other responsibilities. Like, why am I being penalized for that? But I think, you need to embrace that. You need to also be clear. And I think you show up when it matters. It's quality over quantity.
Mhm.
And I do believe that. Now, that's my belief. That's not everybody's belief. And I think that's where we need to change. And with people living older, longer, this idea of elderly care is going to continue to be more of a pressing priority for many, balancing both their own children as well as now the care of their parents. And I would say this is not limited just to people who have children. I don't want to discriminate. That
Yeah, of
flexibility can come
course.
from whatever priorities are in your life, pets in your life, school, friends. It doesn't matter. I think that flexibility is about empowering and believing your workforce and not penalizing them for it when it's something you have built into your ecosystem.
Guys, I think it's a very, very interesting conversation, the one that we're having right now, and we can go on for hours. But
Easy.
if there is kind of like one thing I would keep is it's simply that, it's Women's History Month, but history won't really move itself. It's the people with power that will be able to do so.
Christine, and it's about, and equity isn't a moment. It isn't performative. It isn't a nice to have. It is a deliberate choice that has to be made repeatedly.
Yes, every day. And, it's not Women's History Month isn't about how far we've come, but it's about how much further we still need to push and keeping it beyond just a month in the year. It's every day making, that choice and being very consistent with it.
I just want to thank everybody for like tuning in for this topic. I think it's super, super important. And hopefully if this episode kind of like hit for you, go to the FMCG guys also for the industry lens of things.
And SHeCOMMERCE for the human one.
Yeah. Same
Same
truth.
truth. Yeah. Same
Different mic.
truth, different mic. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry. So, Christine, thank you so much for joining and doing this episode. It was so much fun and just the real talk. We could seriously go on and on about these things and, how we'd like to see them progress. But we really appreciate your time and the partnership on this. With every episode that we do a pledge to invite you into our sisterhood and continue to pay it forward for future women leaders and advocates. So, Christine, will you take the pledge with us?
and we'll take the pledge and also go find some people to sponsor.
That is
Amazing.
wonderful. Christine, it's been a ton of fun having you on board. You are always welcome at our house. And, we'll even let you bring Daniel next time.
Let's see if
And
we
some
want to do
bubbles.
that.
And some bubbles.
Yes.
And bubbles. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen,
Thanks, guys.
bold brands, fierce. I forgot the words now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I actually forgot the words. But let's
Fierce
try that
women.
again. Ladies and gentlemen, bold brands, fierce women, one sisterhood. And cut.
Thank you.
Gracious. I think middle of the day.